Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center of Western Pennsylvania podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kishore Velody, and today we're going to take a totally different look at Down syndrome. We've focused on medical and developmental and educational issues in Down syndrome, but I thought, wouldn't it be great if we once had a podcast that talked about the history of Down syndrome? Where did the name even come from? What's the history behind how the diagnosis was made and things like that? So I was seeking somebody who might have some interest in this. And wouldn't you know, I know a medical historian who I'll have Kristen introduce herself here in just a moment, Dr. Kristen Ehrenberger, and she will tell you a little bit about herself, but I hope that you guys find this as exciting as I do. I really love the idea of medical history and really how it also pertains to things today in terms of people using antiquated word choices or the way women in medicine have been treated in the years. I just think there's so much, even within the history of Down syndrome, where we can touch on those things. But before we get too far, Dr. Ehrenberger, would you mind introducing yourself to us? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, why medical history gets you excited like that, and things like that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Velody, for having me on the podcast. It's a real honor. So my name is Dr. Kristen Ehrenberger, and I am both a physician and a historian of medicine. So I got a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the history of medicine, where I specialize in the study of the body, of nutrition, particularly in modern United States and Germany. I also have a particular interest in the history of disability because my clinical interest with my MD is in the niche called complex care. So I did a combined residency in internal medicine and pediatrics here at UPMC and Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh so that I could take care of children and adults who have special needs. I graduated from residency in June of 2020, and in September, I started my faculty position in the Department of Internal Medicine, where I am now the director of the Progressive Evaluation and Referral Clinic, or PERC, which is a primary care clinic for adults who have childhood onset conditions.
That's so great. And tell our audience a little bit about what is it about the history of medicine that you've dedicated so much of your training in your life to so far?
Absolutely. My love of reading began when I was a child. And through that, I discovered first historical fiction and then historical nonfiction. And I thought that I would be a history major in college because I liked it and was good at it. And then maybe I would sort of dabble after I started practice of medicine. But a mentor turned me on to the idea of a dual degree program. And so I've been able to take my love of stories about people and the way that they relate to their bodies and what they think about illness and disease and make a career out of it.
Wow, that's so cool. Well, I'm really glad that you're going to join us today and talk about this topic, which is so important to our listeners, but just to understand kind of the background of things. So why don't we just get started with, tell us a little bit about what we should know about the history of the discovery, I suppose, or the diagnosing of somebody with this thing called Down syndrome.
Sure. So Down syndrome is named for an English physician who lived in the 19th century. His name was John Langdon Down. He was born in 1828. His father was an apothecary, which is sort of an old-fashioned pharmacist, and his mother was an immigrant from Ireland. John dabbled in surgery, pharmaceuticals, a little bit of early physics before eventually going to medical school and getting his medical degree. He was appointed to be head of an asylum in England where he worked for 10 years. So they did have institutions for people who were differently abled at the time. And he and his wife did a lot of reform there at the Earlswood Asylum, where they wanted to have more humane care of the people who were living there. And he did a lot of this out of his Christian belief and background was his motivation. So while he was working at this asylum, he wrote a paper. In 1866, it was published called, quote, observations on an ethnic classification of idiots, end quote. And so I know that that's an offensive word to use for a human being today, but in the 19th century, an idiot, quote unquote, was a medical term for somebody who had an intellectual disability.
Wow.
Yeah, so our terminology has changed a lot.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Down was entering into a larger discussion about the science of race. So let's take a little detour here.
Okay.
Natural historians, I don't want to say scientists, because the word scientist wasn't actually coined until 1834. But back before then, in the 1700s, in the 18th century, the natural historians were trying to figure out, why are people different from each other? Why do they look different? Why are their bodies shaped differently, their hair and their eyes and their skin? And there was a certain group of people called monogenicists, meaning one origin, who argued that all of the different peoples of the world had a single origin. At that time, they would have said probably the Garden of Eden, because, again, it was a highly Christian culture in Europe. Or today we might say coming out of Africa, and that it was various environmental and genetic factors that made people different from each other, although they started the same. There was a different group of people who thought that all of the races each had their own origins. This is something called polygenesis, or many origins. These thinkers said that human beings can be put into different groups, and the groups are so different, there's no way they could have a common origin. And so one of the thinkers who published about this was a German by the name of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And in the late 1700s, he wrote a book, originally in Latin, actually, because that was the language of natural philosophy, that divided human beings into 5 races, and that were conventionally, each one had a name and a color that was associated with it. So it's a very simplified way of thinking about human diversity. Mm-hmm. According to Blumenbach, there were quote unquote Caucasians, or white people who lived in Europe, quote unquote Mongolians, or yellow-skinned people who lived in Asia. He said there were, quote, Malayans, or brown-skinned people who lived in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. He lumped all of Africa together into, quote, Ethiopians, or people who would have so-called black skin. And then in the North and South American continent, he called those Americans, or quote unquote red-skinned people. And it was based on this grouping that Dr. Down chose the word Mongolian to describe the children of some people who were otherwise thought of as white Europeans, but who had, quote, Mongoloid features, so namely the epicanthal eye folds that many but not all individuals who have Down syndrome exhibit. Dr. Down was trying to argue that if a so-called white parent could have a so-called Asian child, then actually all human beings were related to each other, that they all came from a single origin. So Dr. Down was a monogenist, and that is why Down syndrome used to be called Mongolism, but that's not a term we use anymore.
Wow, what an interesting walk through history. I mean, just showing how thoughts on race could impact even just the way that a scientific thinker like Dr. Down would maybe title a paper or discuss it in that time frame. Obviously, thankfully, very different than where we are today. But we still have a ways to go in medicine, I'm sure, in current history as well, that has shown. So what more about Dr. Down? Like what more did you discover about him as you were looking into him?
Oh, sure. So Dr. Down, as I said, was a reformer. He ended up leaving the Earlswood Asylum because the Board of Regents wouldn't pay his wife for her work in the asylum. He thought that women were just as capable of working outside of the home and should be recognized for that. So he left, and he and his wife started their own institution called Norman's Field, where they took on the children of rich families who had various kinds of disabilities.
Wow. And so that became kind of his life's work at that point. And was there, as far as you're reading, anything like, did they specifically try to take people with what would eventually be called Down syndrome, or was that a specific disability that would be involved in that place?
Yes, excellent question.
Yeah.
No, I don't believe that the numbers were high enough for them to only take that particular condition. As it turns out, Dr. Down also described what we would later come to call Prader-Willi. So he had a general interest in individuals with special needs.
I didn't realize that. And then tell me more about Dr. Down's family, because I think there's something that I've certainly heard before, but did he also have a family member who ended up having the syndrome named after himself?
That's true. Dr. Down and his wife had two sons, Reginald and Percival, and both of them went into medicine. Now, Dr. Down died relatively young in let's see, where did I have it in my little notes here? He died in 1896. And then in 1905, Reginald's son was born with this condition, Down syndrome, although that's not what it would have been called at the time. Yeah.
Very interesting. And do we know, or maybe there isn't a set year or date, when people started to call Down syndrome, or was, when they moved on from those, what we would consider offensive terms at this time?
Yes. And I'm going to take another excursion through medical to answer that question.
Perfect.
So in the 19th century, after Dr. Down's paper, it would have been called Mongolism. And then, so one of the things that Dr. Down was interested in was, why were children born differently? And he wrote some other papers about how the health of the mom and the dad might impact on a pregnancy and the child. One of his arguments was that girls and women should be allowed to go to school and to work, because that was actually good for them and their families, as opposed to the mainstream medical opinion, which was that education and employment were too strenuous for women and that could harm their pregnancies. So he actually had a really progressive view of women. But it's very interesting because we're trying to figure out what was the cause and how was that discovered? Because way back in the 18th century, sometimes people would say, it was the alignment of the stars, or I caught a sudden chill and that's why my baby turned out the way it did. Or, if a woman experienced a strong emotion like fright or anger, maybe that would cause a congenital condition in the child. Well, it turns out then in the early 20th century, and by the 1950s, genes are discovered. So there's this idea that there's DNA that can have the code. And so the extra 21st chromosome was discovered in the 1950s.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then we could say, it's not because of anything that mom or dad did, and it's not because of the stars, it's actually because of the genes that makes this condition.
That's really interesting. And I think even in that period of almost 100 years, when people were coming up with theories, if I remember correctly, please tell me if I'm wrong, they used to think that even like maternal tuberculosis infection or hypothyroidism could also be the cause of Down syndrome. I remember reading that along the way. Did you come across that in any of your research, or maybe I'm just making that up?
That one I didn't see, but I want to caution us, because we say, there's no such thing as maternal imprinting. That was that idea that a strong emotion could cause something. Yeah. But it is true that the health of the mother or the age of the father can impact pregnancies. And so we think about things like fetal alcohol syndrome. So there are some associations, but It's not as many as we used to think.
So then in the 1950s, they discover that there's an extra chromosome 21 in these patients and these people who have Down syndrome. And that changed everything, I'm sure, in the thought processes of science moving forward, I would assume.
Yes. So tell us about some of the controversy around the discovery.
Oh, for me, one of the things that I've always found interesting in medicine is how, especially in the 1900s, where the lab would be named after the male physician who was the head of the lab. So Jerome Lejeune's lab was the one that discovered the extra chromosome 21 as the cause of Down syndrome. So then Dr. Lejeune, who was getting all of the credit for that discovery, and it was only really more recently, in the more recent past, that most likely it was a woman working in his lab named Martha Gautier, who probably was the one who said, hey, look at this. There's actually an extra chromosome 21 that seems to be the cause. And unfortunately, because of the era, she did not get the credit that one would expect someone who's working in that lab to get. And so it's just a very interesting commentary on medicine as we've gone through race and gender and all of the things that we talk about today as being areas that we need to focus on in medicine and culture in general, in terms of working on those areas and recognizing that there are people who have been forgotten and people who have been missed over the years that need to get the credit where they need to get it. So I think that's a really cool story about Martha Gautier as well that I had come across. So
absolutely. And so now we're at the point in the chronology when we can talk about, when did we start calling it Down syndrome?
Yes.
Or maybe you've heard it referred to as Down's syndrome with an apostrophe S.
Sure.
Well, in 1965, the World Health Organization changed the official name of the condition that we now call trisomy 21 from Mongolism to Down syndrome in the United States, or Down's syndrome in the United Kingdom, at the request of the Mongolian People's Republic.
Wow.
Because the government of the country didn't like being associated with this disability.
Isn't that amazing? I didn't realize it was that recent that change and why that change would have come about.
Mm-hmm.
And is it just a nature of the UK and the US wanting to be different, or is there a reason why one would want the apostrophe S and one would not?
So it turns out in 1975, the National Institutes of Health here in the United States dropped the possessive because they were trying to be more accurate in the way that diseases and other conditions are named. So consider something like Lou Gehrig's disease. Mm-hmm. So Lou Gehrig's disease is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which most people call ALS because that's less of a mouthful. Well, Lou Gehrig, the baseball player, actually had ALS, but Dr. John Down did not have his syndrome. And so that's why the NIH said in 1975, we should drop the apostrophe S.
Isn't that interesting? And that I think would then apply to really any named condition when we're talking about something. If the person who described it didn't have that condition, then we really shouldn't, in the US at least, have the apostrophe S. How about that? Mm-hmm. Well, great. Well, Kristen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing these really very interesting historical tidbits. And I hope that the families and folks listening can now go with that understanding of how the condition was even named in the beginning and what the thought processes were of what maybe caused it. And then, of course, discoveries of chromosomes and all of the controversies that go along in there, including how do you name with an apostrophe or not an apostrophe S. Really neat stuff. Thank you so much for joining us today. Anything else that you wanted to share with us? Or are we at a point in the podcast where you're thinking we've got a pretty good feeling for things?
I think that's it. It was really fun to come on and tell you about this really interesting history that I've wondered about since I first encountered Down syndrome when I was a girl. We used to watch the television show Life Goes On,
sure, yeah,
where Chris Burke played Corky.
Yes.
And that's how I first saw people with Down syndrome, was not as patients, but as, people, brothers, sons, just normal people.
Yeah, that definitely was a culture-changing show for the short period of time that it was on TV. I think that definitely did change some perceptions. So that's really great. Well, thank you so much again for joining us today. And to our listeners, I hope that this was as fun for you to learn as for me. I know I'm going to have generations of residents and medical students who will learn even more about the history of Down syndrome because of what I've learned today on this podcast. So that's so fantastic. If you guys, again, as always, have any information that you're looking for, anything at all, as you can imagine, that we will discuss, as long as it pertains to Down syndrome, please send us an email to downsyndromecenter@chp.edu, and we'll be glad to find experts like Dr. Ehrenberger who can talk about these types of topics and give us more information. But until next time, bye-bye.